Welcome to the second episode of the City Health and Wellbeing podcast brought to you by the Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI. My name is Gokul Chakravarti, and I am the producer of this podcast. In the first episode, Vishal spoke to Steve Sinderby, his colleague at the York, UK office of SEI and a co-lead of SEI's City Health and Wellbeing Initiative. They set the stage for this season of this podcast by painting the larger picture of the initiative for us. In this, the second episode, we take the conversation forward as Vishal peels this onion further, this time with another colleague of his. Let's join them.
I'm your host, Vishal Mehta. I'm a senior scientist with the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI. With the City Health and Wellbeing Initiative, we are interested in unpacking what makes a city a healthy environment where every citizen can have the opportunity to thrive. In this second episode, we talk about the citizen science activities that we engaged with Rachel Pateman from SEI's York Centre, based at the University of York in the UK. Rachel works on climate change, conservation biology, and citizen science. Welcome, Rachel. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Vishal.
Rachel, would you like to share something more about yourself with our audience today before we get started?
Sure. So I've been working at SEI at the University of York for the last 10 years. Before that, I did my PhD at the University of York as well. And that was on climate change biology. So looking at how species are responding to climate change. And in my research, I used a lot of volunteer collected data, which was really fantastic for answering these questions that we have about how species are responding to these big global changes. And so, actually, in the last 10 years at SEI, I've been working more on volunteer collected data or citizen science. So, thinking about how we can engage members of the public in scientific research to answer real world scientific questions.
So, you mentioned volunteer collected data and citizen science. Is there a nuance between those two? As you know, we do a lot of participatory work in
Mm,
all our offices across SEI, and this range from different levels of engagement with the stakeholders, with communities,
mhm,
governments, all our other clients and partners. So, can you distinguish for our audience, what is citizen science and what is
mhm.
not citizen science?
Mhm. Sure. So I think broadly we can think of citizen science as being the partnering of members of the public with professional scientists or researchers to answer real world scientific questions. But actually it's a really broad range of approaches. So there are lots of different types of citizen science. So
Hmm.
there are types of citizen science that we can think of as being what we call contributory. So members of the public are mainly involved in producing data, which is then analysed by professional scientists. And we can think of things like Galaxy Zoo, where people have been involved in processing images, and the results of that are then used by scientists in their research. Or we can think of like the data that I used in my PhD. So particularly in the UK and the US, we have this really long history of people, volunteers going out and making records of things like birds and butterflies. And those
Hmm.
records are submitted to scientists who then process that data and use it in their own research. So there are lots and lots of projects like that across a range of topics, which we would call contributory citizen science. And then we have citizen science, which is a bit more allied, I guess, with what we think of as other participatory approaches to research, a bit more allied with participatory action research, where actually people are involved in all stages of the research process. So they're involved in defining what the problem is. They're involved in developing the methods that we use. They're then involved in collecting the data, analyzing the
Hmm.
data, and doing something with the results. I guess where the distinction is from other forms of participatory research is that kind of scientific element. So we're answering a scientific question rather than
Hmm.
the product being an action or a thing that we're producing, although that can be also a byproduct of citizen science. we're thinking about, right, they're involved in a piece of scientific research.
Listening to Rachel define citizen science reminded me of something that I had not thought of for more than 2 decades now. When I was in grad school in the US in the late 90s, there was this screensaver that was making the rounds amongst researchers all across the country. It was invented by the team at the SETI or SETI project, whose goal was to discover extraterrestrial life. And any computer that had this screensaver installed was lending some of its processing power to meet the massive processing demands of that project. A few years later, the word crowdsourcing came into common parlance, and today, crowdfunding is ubiquitous. So I asked Rachel if I was right in making connections between these and citizen science.
Yes. Yeah, so I think crowdsourcing is often seen as a form of citizen science. Um, I think where it gets a bit blurry is these projects where the member of the public doesn't necessarily have any active involvement in the project. And a useful resource is the European Citizen Science Association's um, principles of citizen science. So they've got these 10 principles of citizen science, which allow you to think about what makes a good citizen science project, but also helps you to think about whether something is citizen science or not. And they speak very clearly about active involvement of the member of the public in the project, and that the participant has gained some benefit from participating. Whether that can just be enjoyment, that can be learning something, all the way through to something that might significantly change the way that you're living your life. Um, but yeah, I think those projects where there's passive involvement of the public, which might be like this kind of distributed um, computing power, might be seen perhaps slightly outside of citizen science, but obviously it is a very kind of allied approach of some way of engaging the public with science and doing science.
Thanks, Rachel. As you know, we've been working with two cities through this initiative. There's Nakuru in Kenya and Udon Thani in Thailand. I was wondering if we can hear from you about the different kinds of citizen science activities that we engaged
Mhm.
in over the last few years in Nakuru, and if you can, contrast it with Udon.
Sure. So, I guess the work that I was mainly involved in was on the co-created citizen science projects that we
Mhm.
worked on in those cities. And like I say, co-creation is a form of citizen science where the communities that we're working with, the members of the public, are involved in all stages of the research. Um,
Right.
so we did co-created projects in both Nakuru and in Udon, and I can talk through a little bit about the process that we followed in Nakuru and the activities that we did there.
Yeah, sure, Rachel. I remember I was involved in some of these. In
Hmm.
particular, I was also interested in drawing out the differences between different neighborhoods in a city. So, for
Hmm.
example, the problem definition for different neighborhoods, I would
Hmm.
imagine in any city in the world, could be
Hmm.
quite different depending on uh, you know the cultural makeup, the
Hmm.
economic makeup of that neighborhood, whether it's
Hmm.
new, whether it's old, whether
Hmm.
it has good services for electricity, water, sanitation, waste management.
Hmm.
So I'm sure that we encountered these types of issues in the different neighborhoods in Nakuru. Would you like to describe some of them?
Sure. So, our research in Nakuru, or our projects in Nakuru, focused actually really on the more deprived neighbourhoods in the city.
Mm.
Um, so we went through a process with the community of working together with them and the community partner that we worked with, the Umande Trust, who'd worked with that community a lot in the past. Um, and actually, that's something to really reflect on, is how that community partner really opened up access to that community for us as researchers
Mhm.
coming in from the outside. Um, So we arranged a series of workshops with that community where we asked them to think about what are the issues that are affecting your well-being. What are the issues that you would like to tackle and that you think we might be able to help you with by going through a process of collecting some data about those issues. So
Mm-hmm.
we had it, like I say, we had a series of workshops, and we allowed people to express a range of opinions about what they felt their priorities were in terms of issues that affected their well-being. They were quite wide ranging. So things around waste management, water management, flooding, etc., came up repeatedly, as well as some issues around things like stray animals and antisocial behaviour. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, our reflection was that these were all kind of interconnected issues. So the lack of service provision in these neighbourhoods, actually, the issues that they have around water management and flooding are a result of poor waste management often. So
Mm-hmm.
what we kind of recognized with the community was they're talking about all these different issues, but actually they're really interconnected, and they are all feeding into each other, and they all come from the root cause of there being poor service provision in this particular neighbourhood. So actually, what we decided with the community through this kind of iterative process of getting them to think through these participatory activities that we arranged, getting them to think about what the issues were, talking to their other community members about these issues, and then voting and ranking on what they thought the most important ones were. We
Right.
came to the conclusion that actually all these issues are interconnected, and what we should do is try and map them all, and that's what the focus of the project was in the end, this kind of mapping of these environmental issues that people were felt that were impacting their well-being in their neighborhood. But like you say,
Right,
if we'd have
Rachel.
done this
Yeah.
project in a high income neighborhood or a middle income neighborhood, we would have probably identified much different issues to the ones that we did in this low income neighborhood that we worked in.
Right, Rachel. I was also wondering how was the interaction with the local municipality and government, because I I know that this work really engaged the community,
Hmm.
made them feel like they had some say and some understanding of their own situation.
Hmm.
But in what ways did we try to bring it
Hmm.
to the level of government and services? And how do you generally think that this kind of work could lead to change and improved services for communities?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think the first thing that we did was we had meetings with the people from the local authority, from different departments, and we told them about the project and what we were hoping to do. So we went through this period of sensitization, where we told them about what our plans were, um, and then at the end of the
Hmm.
project, we shared the results with them. I think if we were doing this again and we had more time and resource, we would have probably tried to engage those people, people that could use the data and do something with it more deeply throughout the project. Because I
Hmm.
think one of the challenges we have with citizen science often is that we can produce this data and then maybe nothing happens with it. And
Right.
I don't think that was necessarily the case in this project, but the more deeply you engage an end user of that data throughout the project, the more likely they are to be receptive to the results of that project, the more likely you are to be able to tailor the data that you're collecting to their needs as well as the needs of the community. Um, there were constraints within this project. It was a pilot project. We didn't have a huge amount of time. We didn't have a huge amount of resource. So we did the best with the resources that we had, and we
Hmm.
did have some good outcomes in the end in terms of sharing that data with the authority. Um, but I think ideally you would have that deeper engagement, like you say, with somebody that can actually do something and bring about some change as a result of the project.
Right, Rachel. I was just wondering, before this podcast, I was doing some thinking, and I've had a thought for a while about whether these types of citizen science activities can be embedded in the kind of organizational structure, institutionalized, and be part of just everyday governance and management of a city.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as possible, and do you have any examples of where something like this is being done? I know that there's some work in right there in York that's going on that's doing this, right?
Mm-hmm. I think there are examples, and but I think, say, in the global north, we've had a much longer history of using citizen science than in the
Mm-hmm.
global south.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a huge amount of work that's gone on in North America, for example, working with the government to explore how the government can use citizen science data. Same in Europe. There's a huge amount of work and resource that's gone into working with policymakers and demonstrating to policymakers how reliable citizen science data is and how it can be really used to not just generate data that decision makers can be used, but really to bring to the fore what what their citizens feel and is important to them, and to bring in their perspectives to decision making. And we know that if the perspectives of citizens are brought into that decision making, those decisions will be better for the citizens, and any decisions that are made are more likely to be accepted by citizens. So, like I say, I think a huge amount of work has gone in to a lot of regions in the global north to really get policymakers
Mm.
to trust citizen science data. And I think we're at the start of that process in the global south. So I think there are, and we probably faced more challenges just because that experience with citizen science is not there yet for policymakers, and it's a different way of thinking about generating data and engaging with citizens that perhaps policymakers aren't familiar or comfortable with. And we've got to kind of go along that journey of yeah, getting that trust, I guess, in the process.
Right. So coming back to Nakuru, Rachel,
Hmm.
what were the main findings? I think you touched upon some of them, but
Hmm.
I was wondering if there were some highlights that really stand out for you in terms of findings for these different neighborhoods from
Hmm.
the citizen science activities, and
Hmm.
also if you were able to reflect back once it was done on some of the advantages and limitations of those activities.
Hmm. So, like I say, we had this process where we engaged with the community in deciding on what the topic of the project
Mm-hmm.
was. Our next step was to then engage them in deciding on what the methodology would be for collecting the data. And that again was an iterative process with the research team going away and drafting some suggestions, which then they shared with the community, who then refined them. This research team then went away, produced a final version of the survey that was then piloted by the community, and that based on those pilots it was then refined, and we kind of came up with the final version. So the final version was a survey that was designed on a platform called EpiCollect, which is a
Mm-hmm.
platform that's available for anybody to use to develop their own citizen science survey. And so for ours, what we were asking members of the community to do was to use a tablet, which we as SEI researchers provided to them. They went around the community and walked particular routes, and they took photos of things that they thought were issues. So often that was an example of a piece of infrastructure that was broken or some waste that was causing a problem. They took a photo
Mm-hmm.
of it. They recorded the kind of type of problem that it was. They recorded whether it had been reported previously, and
Right.
who it had been reported to, and whether anything had been done about it. And so
Right.
actually that was the kind of critical thing that came out of it at the end. So when we shared the data, or when the community shared the data with the authority at the end of the project, what they felt they really got out of it was that their problems had been heard by the authority, but which was fantastic, and they felt like, right, these problems are now on the map. The authority can see what we're dealing with day to day.
Mm-hmm.
But also the authority could see, well, actually where you've been reporting these problems to is probably not the most appropriate place. So they were then able to share
Mm-hmm.
with the community, actually, if it's this type of problem, it's this authority or this service provider who the problem should be reported to. And that led to the community saying, actually, now we know who to report to, and we know that actually that will speed up how quickly these problems are dealt with. So the community felt like that was a real benefit of the project, that had been clarified, and that led to these issues being dealt with more promptly.
Well, I was just remembering this part of the project that I was also engaged in, and thinking that this is exactly an example of an activity that could actually be institutionalized and be part
Mhm,
of the
mhm,
municipalities' way
mhm,
of doing things, and could be related to monitoring of their
mhm,
systems. It could
mhm,
be related to performance metrics for the utility itself,
mhm,
in terms of how efficient they are, how quick they are at responding. Plus, it could help them also know where the problems are across the city in the first
mhm.
place.
Exactly. And it all, if we think about the sustainable development goals, it ticks a lot of
Hmm.
those boxes as well. Thinking about whether people are engaged in decision making in cities, how pleased people are with the services that are provided to them. There are lots of ways that this kind of engagement in data production and feeding that
Right,
into the decisions that are made within cities can tick a lot of those targets within the sustainable development goals as well.
right.
So I think,
So, go ahead.
building on that, another thing that came out of the project was just a raised awareness amongst the community about environmental issues and the impact that they can
Hmm.
have on their health and well-being. And people from the community reported that they shared that with other members of the community who weren't involved in the project. And again,
Hmm.
that's ticking another sustainable development goal box in terms of raising awareness of and increasing the education of environmental and sustainability issues. So there's lots of different ways that citizen science can be of benefit to all different partners involved. And I think that's a really crucial thing when we're thinking about what is citizen science. We need to
Hmm.
think about what is the benefit to the participant, and what is the benefit to the researcher, and what is the benefit potentially to another organization that might do something with that data that's not a scientific output. And I think if you can tick those boxes for all of those, then you've got a good citizen science project.
Right. I mean, my next thought I had was something I asked Steve in the first episode, Steve
Hmm.
Sinderby, of this podcast. And the question is, what do you think is going to happen in these cities that we worked in once the project is done? Do you think that Umandi Trust, the local
Hmm.
NGO, or some other local partners would be able to pick it up and adapt it and run with it?
I think resourcing is always a real challenge, and we often find this in citizen science, that you are funded to do a project, and that funding comes to an end, and then what do you do? And that can be a
Hmm.
real challenge. I think, like I was talking about earlier, you can do so much with the resource that you have available, but actually, citizen science is pretty resource intensive. I think it's often seen as kind of
Right.
a cheap way of collecting data, um, which in some cases it might be when you've got these kind of mass participation projects where you're asking lots and lots of people to go out and collect a small amount of data that scientists would have no way of doing on their own, and the
Hmm.
scientists can then sit in their office and process that data. That is potentially a cost saving way of collecting data. But actually, when you're doing this in-depth stuff with communities, you need to support them. You need to
Right.
be constantly communicating with them, giving them feedback, checking they're on track, giving them reassurance, answering their problems. So that requires a lot of resource in terms of time and people. Um, and so for something
Hmm.
to be got ongoing in the long term, I think it would need to be funded by the people and supported by the people that are going to use that data, which in a case like this would be
Exactly.
the local authority. It wouldn't be possible for the Amando Trust, who does not have very much resource. It wouldn't be feasible for us as SEI to continue supporting like something like that in the long term.
Yeah.
So it's about raising that awareness of like this is a valuable way of collecting data and understanding the problems that your citizens are experiencing and their priorities, and for the authority then to invest in supporting that as an activity.
Right. So, Rachel, just on that point, do you think that we at SEI should think about putting some effort into advocating for the institutionalization of these methods
Hmm.
into government institutions?
Yeah, and I think what's been particularly effective in North America and in Europe, Australia, has been the citizen science associations which exist in those places. So the European Citizen
Mm,
Science Association, Citizen Science Association in North America, because they bring together people who are working on, so doing citizen science, um, researching citizen science, and they bring together those people to build expertise, but also to do that kind of lobbying of government and other decision makers and users of data to
okay.
demonstrate to them actually how this can be useful and to kind of show the expertise that exists and to build that expertise. And so I think in places like Asia and in Africa, there are these very new um, citizen science associations which could
Mm,
potentially fill that role. And I think for me, it's up to us to kind of support those associations because I see them as being really critical um, in making those kind of advances in terms of um, increasing the acceptability of the method.
excellent. And what about contrast with Udon Thani in terms of findings?
Hmm.
That's culturally
Yeah.
different, a different country.
Mm.
We are going to have another episode that focuses on Udon Thani, but I was wondering if you
Hmm.
could give us the key messages in terms of how it worked in the two
Hmm.
places, in terms of whether it was more successful in one place and less so in the
Hmm.
other, and any
Hmm.
other sort of highlights you can think
Hmm.
of.
Sure. So we followed the same process in the two cities. Um, I'd say we probably had an easier time in Nakuru, and probably there were more um, tangible outcomes and impacts of the project in Nakuru than there were in Udon. It's difficult to say whether that's a cultural thing. I think part of the problem that we had was that we were working in Udon, which is quite a long way from Bangkok, where our SCI colleagues are based. And so we didn't probably have as regular contact with the communities in Udon as we did in Nakuru. And we also didn't have we had a consultant who was based in Udon who helped us with interacting with the community, but we didn't have this kind of existing trusted community partner that we did in Nakuru that the community already knew and already had a relationship with. Um, so I think the problems or the challenges that we had in Udon were rooted in just not really being able to build up a relationship and a rapport with the communities. Um, and I think that that comes back to this issue that we just probably weren't there enough um, to do that. And that's no nobody's fault. It was just the resources that we had,
Hmm.
and we did the best with what we had available to us. But I think that just emphasizes this point that actually doing this kind of co-created citizen science is really resource intensive, and you do need to have this regular contact with communities and build up this trusted relationship with them. The result of that was that they were less engaged, enthusiastic about the project, which meant that they were less really willing to go out and do loads of data collection. So the project was focused around waste, and they did go out and they did this waste mapping. So it ended up being reasonably similar to what we did in Nakuru in terms of the topic. And they ended up with this map of the waste issues in the community, but there were less kind of tangible outcomes from that. I think the other problem that we had in Udon was that actually when we went through that process that I spoke about in Nakuru of how we chose the topic that we would focus on, the topics that they were saying were most important to them were things that we didn't feel like we had the expertise to actually lead a project on, or facilitate a
Hmm.
project on. So it was things about the safety of the electrical wiring and like dog fouling and stray cats and dogs and things like that. So these were coming out as the issues that were most important to them, but we felt, gosh, we don't have
Hmm.
the expertise to facilitate a project on that. So we ended up doing something on their kind of third priority, which was waste. And again, that probably meant that they were less engaged with it because it wasn't their thing that
Right.
they'd said was the thing that was most important to them.
And I think one of the other drivers of these differences is probably just that Udon is in a better socioeconomic state than Nakuru, the
Hmm.
communities we worked in. So the
Hmm.
kinds of problems were
Hmm.
probably not as severe
Hmm.
in terms of
Yeah,
services.
yeah. So Diane, if it's Diane that you're speaking to in SEI Asia,
Right.
when she comes on, she'll reflect on some of this because she was more deeply engaged with it than I was. But I know she's reflected to me that maybe we did things the wrong way round. So we went and we said, we've got this method that we want to use. It's citizen science. Can you tell us a topic that we could do a citizen science project on?
Hmm.
And her feeling was, actually, should we have thought about the topic first and then said, right, who can we engage with who's interested in that project? And selected a community or a group that was already working on that project or interested in on topic or interested in that topic,
Hmm.
and then thought about, right, what's the best method to tackle this? Or the approach could be, you go to a community, you say, what are the topics that are affecting you? And then we design a project and think about the methods based on that. So there are obviously lots of different starting points to these projects. And there are lots of different starting points to doing a co-created citizen science project. Often it's not the researchers that go to the community and
Right.
say, let's do a co-created citizen science project. Actually, often it's the community that say to researchers, we've got this problem, can you help us? And the researchers will then help them do some data collection, some science to tackle that. So it's thinking about what that starting point is. And I think in Udon, it just highlighted that maybe it wasn't quite the right starting point.
I remember at the beginning, when I was involved in some of the earlier discussions, we were thinking about working in schools in Udon Thani on
Mm,
a water quality
mhm,
monitoring sort of
mhm,
effort,
mhm,
which we didn't follow up with for
mhm,
various reasons. But what you're pointing out reminds me that with the co-created version of citizen science, we don't really know what's emerging
mm,
beforehand, and so that adds a particular wrinkle,
mm,
which makes this very distinct from other
mhm.
science and research methods.
Yeah, and I think, what we've found and what other people have found in these types of projects, that can be a very uncomfortable experience for everybody involved. So it can be uncomfortable for people funding
Hmm.
projects because a lot of people don't want to fund projects that they don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's very
Yes.
difficult to write a funding proposal to get money for a project where you say, well, we're just going to go and engage with the community, and what comes out is what they're interested in doing. It can be uncomfortable for researchers to um, give up some of the power. So, what people often say about co-created citizen science is that the power dynamics change, and what you want really is for that power to be equally distributed between all partners. It's not the scientists who are leading it and the participants are, doing what the scientists are asking of them. It should be everybody's voice is equal. But equally, that can be very uncomfortable for the participants, the community members, because they're thinking, well, you're the scientists, you know what we're
Yeah, you
supposed to
tell
be
us what to
doing.
do. Yeah.
They you tell us what to do. They're used to that power dynamic of,
Yes.
doing what they're being asked to do. And that's why I think it comes back to this point of allowing time and resource to build up those relationships, because that transfer of power won't happen quickly. It needs to happen over a long time after you've built up these relationships with people and you've got that trust. So I think, that's why we wanted to do these projects. We wanted to test out whether it works. We wanted to know what the challenges were. We wanted to know what the successes were. And we wanted to share that with the wider community of people doing citizen science, because we want to be able to share our experiences. And actually, other people are having these other challenges with doing citizen science. And so, in particular, co-created citizen science. And it's about building that body of evidence of, right, what works, what doesn't work, so that when somebody else is going to do one of these projects in the future, they can learn from what we've done and the lessons that we've come out with from these pilot projects that we've done.
Right. Well, Rachel, I know that your kids are coming back home soon. And
Yes.
I think that before we call this episode done, I guess I wanted to just ask you if there's any other highlights that you would like to share with our audience before we say bye.
I think a highlight has been, particularly in Nakuru, the enthusiasm that was shown by the community members that we were working with to really deeply engage with what we were doing. And that's, as a researcher, working in those within those projects, I think that's the best thing that you can hope for sometimes, is always a very nice outcome, is seeing that people are invested and feel like this is worthwhile, and feeling enthusiastic about it. And yeah, and for us, I think that's a real positive.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed that.
Thank you for being with us for episode 2 of this podcast on city health and well-being. Look forward to seeing you again for episode 3. Thank you and bye. SEI is an international nonprofit that works in several countries at the intersection of science and policy. You can find out more about us at www.sei.org.